Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to today's Presentism in Teaching History webinar. Before we go any further, I'd like to take this opportunity to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded and that the resulting recording will be posted online and circulated by email after the event. My name is Rodri Mogford, and I'm the Senior Publisher for the Bloomsbury Academic History List and the in-house editor for the Bloomsbury History Theory and Method digital resource. The resource was named one of the best databases of 2022 by Library Journal, and you can see some quotes from their review on the slide that you can see on your screens now. Bloomsbury History Theory and Method is an educational resource dedicated to historiography and the examination of historical theory and methods using a global approach. With an ever-growing content base, currently includes 167 exclusive articles by authors based in 29 different countries, a 4-volume major reference work on the global history of historiography, and 71 ebooks focused on topics related to the subject. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce Tyson Retz, who will be chairing the discussion today. Tyson is an associate professor at the University of Stavanger in Norway, and a vital member of the academic editor team who works so impressively on the Bloomsbury History Theory and Method digital resource. You can also see some of the names of the other members of the editor team on this slide, including our editor-in-chief, Stefan Berger. I'm pleased to say that Tyson is joined by 5 of the contributors to the resource, all experts in their field, so that they can helpfully share their thoughts on presentism with us, both in the context of their own resource articles and on a wider level. Tyson will kindly introduce them individually very shortly. But for now, I'd just like to say a very warm welcome to Tyson and the panel. And thank you all in advance for what I'm sure will prove a lively and fascinating hour of discussion and insight.
Thank you, Rogie, for the introduction. Welcome everybody who's attending this webinar today, and especially welcome to the 5 panelists. I'm really excited about hearing what you have to say about presentism today. I'll introduce all 5 panelists together, and then we will proceed to interview each panelist. Rodri has already said something about them. Terrell Carver is a professor of political theory at the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom. He's with us today because he's written for the Bloomsbury resource, a classic text in context, and that is, of course, Marx's Capital, which is exclusive to the resource. Professor Antoinette Burton is a professor of history at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the United States, of course. She's with us today because she's written an article, a key thinker article on Catherine Hall, which I'm really excited to hear about. Dr. Devin Vatia is assistant professor of history at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. He's with us today because he's written one of our historiography essays on the historiography of race in Enlightenment thought. Really excited for Devin to be with us today. Dr. Nadine Rossell is senior lecturer in history at the University of Essex in the United Kingdom. She's the author of the article Using Primary Sources, Police Records. Really excited to hear about this. For my own purposes, supervising a student who's interested in this right now. That'll be fantastic. And lastly, Professor Henk de Smale, who is Professor of History at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. Henk is with us today because he's written a key concept article on masculinity. That's our 5 panelists, and I'll interview each panelist for roughly 6 minutes. Let's begin with you, Professor Terrell Carver. You've written a text in context article for us on Marx's Capital. And I'm interested in hearing from you about the historical context in which Marx wrote this famous book. If you could tell us something about that, and if you could also tell us something about what you think students might miss were they to neglect the historical context in which that book was written.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'd like to say I was really thrilled with this commission because over the years, Marx hasn't been very popular. with many historians because he wasn't a historian. He didn't write historiographically in the genre. He wasn't a professional of anything. He was a political activist and journalist and pamphleteer. And he tried very hard to be a rabble rouser, but he was more successful with the pen than on the platform. So, of course, there are the Marxist historians who are around in the 20th century, and they've already made up their minds. And of course, that set up a struggle in academia and elsewhere that's as much political as it was intellectual. So it's really interesting that he was chosen to be here. And rather than go deeply into the context of the German state, statelets, principalities, the Austrian Empire, etc., in the 1830s and 1840s, I would focus on the context that students bring to the reading of a book like Capital, whatever kind of class they're in. And consider what they think they know, and to give them an opportunity to find out more and to follow the text in a sense wherever they like. But as they do that, they'll encounter the intellectual historians and the contextual historians who will fill them in on some of the political background that really makes the book go and made Marx go.
You've anticipated my second question there, Professor Carver. I'm interested in your own teaching. Have you observed presentist understandings creep into the study of this book? In answering that, you might want to tell us how you define presentism yourself.
Well, I'm going to be on the radical left field here again, as indeed Marx was with what he wrote. And my view about this is that the present is only the past as far as it has got. And therefore, when we talk about the present, we're only referencing our own interpretations, indeed, of ourselves and of what we think we know, insofar as we're doing that at the moment. So that's my view of the teaching that goes on. But then I have to say, possibly in deference to my colleagues here, that I'm in political theory, political philosophy, and I'm not teaching a history class in a history department, or even saying that I'm a professional historian, although I'm a historian of political thought. So the students and the reading and discussions are all going to be very much in the present. For what the students are concerned with and what they can find in the book that helps them to think about the politics of the present. So I'm resisting the idea that this is anything as crude as drawing lessons from the past, or Marx or Plato or whoever is going to tell us exactly what to do. And in fact, Marx resisted that himself. He's actually quite unpopular with many political people because he said he didn't want to write recipes for the Michelin-starred restaurants of the future. I'm paraphrasing what he actually said. So in my teaching, Capital is very much a way of stimulating students to get to grips with what they're concerned with, or to find out from myself, other students, and readings more about what they ought to be concerned with in terms of politics, political ideas, and concepts.
Thank you. You note in your article that Marx has sometimes been charged with Eurocentrism and racism. To what extent, if at all, do you think that this is a presentist accusation?
Well, I think one needs to consider where this kind of allegation comes from and why and how it's built up over the years. So I would date this to the 1970s and Said's Orientalism, rather than Eurocentrism. I actually really loved the book. But he's very hard on Marxists. He's very hard on anybody writing from an Anglophone, Euro, sort of, American perspective on the subject of knowledge appropriation and indeed of imperialism and subjugation and othering of people with other backgrounds and other concerns, and indeed pushing them into the past and saying that they're only going to get to the modern present with a lot of help, or alternatively that they need to be pushed out of the way. So that's the kind of place that this is coming from. I think what Said says about Marx is really based on Marxists and Marxism. He wasn't a Marx scholar and he didn't particularly want to do that job. My pitch for reading Capital, as you'll find it in the History and Theory collection, is that read the book backwards, because part 8, the final chapters, which have been neglected for many years as not very important and not germane to the argument, are a fantastic manifesto for post-coloniality and decolonization. It's actually all there. It's a story about capitalism as global dispossession by violence, imperialism, slavery is all there. He was well onto it in the 1840s. And many of these allegations arise from people who haven't really looked at what was going on even as early as the 1840s, which is 2 decades before Capital, and the kind of politics that Marx was trying to do. He was basically standing on the Rhine looking east, where these places weren't even countries, so they didn't have empires. They benefited from slavery because everybody did. Outside, or rather in the certain parts of the world, others disbenefited from it. But his political project really was bringing constitutionalism and eventually socialism and economic reform to places that were medieval. And studying capitalism as a warning for what was going to happen to them, and also a forewarning of what was going to happen to the rest of the world. So famously, there's a passage about battering down the Chinese walls, to further the opium trade. So, I mean, he's very much on side. So I think a lot of these allegations are quite unfair.
Thank you, Tara Carver. I'm going to move on now to our second panelist, Dr. Nadine Rossel, who has written for us on using primary, in our collection, using primary sources, and she's concerned in that article with using police records as primary sources. Could you tell us a little bit, Nadine, about the origins of modern policing as described in your article?
Yes, many thanks. I hope the sound is okay, because just when we started, there's a massive thunderstorm going on here. So I hope everyone can hear me okay. I think it's hail or something. Anyway, the origins of policing as we understand it nowadays are, historically speaking, actually fairly recent. I should say I look particularly at continental Europe, so that's where my examples are coming from. But here really enlightened sort of police reformers looked to Paris and to France in the 18th century, and then about a century later to London and the setup of the Metropolitan Police there by Robert Peel in 1829. And that's not to say that there weren't that the task of policing and didn't concern princes or rulers or kings and queens before, but what we consider as sort of modern police forces really relates to the 18th and 19th century. Police forces then had different tasks than today. We tend to think about police forces particularly being occupied with combating crime, and obviously that is a key task of the police and also was in the 18th and 19th century. But at that time, a lot of duties the police had, we would now link to more local authorities or to municipal officers, because a lot of it was around checking permits, maybe for market traders, registering people, dealing with that type of documentation and paperwork, dealing with issues related to public health. So a lot of the tasks that people in those 2 centuries would link to the police, we wouldn't nowadays anymore. And that's not a particularly new thing either. Police tasks change. If we think about that, you know, the 20th century, a massive task for the police is traffic policing, which is hardly an issue in the 19th century. And then if we move on further, there are new fields police forces always add to their portfolio. But I think that's important to keep in mind that in the 19th and 20th century, policing was a much broader category than what we now define as policing.
Yeah, could you talk more a little bit about that, what we consider to be policing and the broader platform on which the concept might have been understood or at least practiced earlier? What are some of the challenges of using police records as historical sources?
In the article for the collection, we look particularly at police records for students. You know, how could students use police records for maybe their first research projects? And in that sense, police records are quite challenging, despite obviously me thinking that they're fascinating. Because first of all, police records are difficult to access. There are very few big online collections of police records. So really, you will ask students to go to archives. They are scattered across archives. You need to know quite a bit about how police forces are organized and to whom they are accountable, to be able to figure out which sort of archive is the right one to go to. So for students, that's not the most appealing source that immediately draws you in. And then, of course, in terms when we actually look at police records, they are very often, we think policing, well, I hope lots of people think policing is a very exciting field, but when we look at police records, they're standardized routine administrative report writing, right? They are often, despite the very exciting topic, quite dull in the way they're written, because they are done by people who are used to standardized report writing and very often are actually much more interested in the part of their work that is not about report writing. So, you know, in terms of, as I said, sort of appeal to draw you in, that is sometimes a tricky source. And of course, police records, particularly like records, I think also from other state organizations, particularly those who have the monopoly of violence, very often conceal more than they reveal, and that's, you know, that's something to work around as well.
Thank you, Nadine. Henk de Smale, you have given us a fantastic article in the key concept section on masculinity, and you note in that article that the concept of masculinity is rather recent, relatively new concept. Could you tell us something about the origins of the concept and how it's sort of gained traction over the years?
Okay, yes, thank you. Yes, of course, speaking about presentism, you know, masculinity always is almost a presentist concept. It's something that originated, let's say, after the Second World War within feminist circles, within feminist studies more broadly, in a tendency, of course, to denaturalize what it is to be a man or a woman, and of course, to kind of criticize or politicize or analyze the workings, for instance, of patriarchal societies and how power is organized in a gendered way. So it's part and parcel, let's say, of the feminist understanding of power and of how societies are organized. Of course, for centuries, people talked about unmanly behavior or manly behavior, or about manhood and things like that. But usually, of course, in a kind of not criticizing or not questioning, say, the natural order of society and the natural, or the understanding that these are natural concepts. So in that sense, it's only after the Second World War, and increasingly so in historiography in the 1980s and then in the 1990s, that you see the rise of books on masculinity and the history of masculinity.
Yeah, and you do note differences between Western, or at least you treat differences between Western and non-Western concepts of masculinity. Could you give us an idea of some of those differences?
Yeah, I'm afraid I haven't done that enough in my article, to be honest. Of course, it's something very challenging if you're asked to write about a concept like masculinity in for a collection like this one in very brief, let's say, kind of article. And so you start, of course, thinking immediately about American and British historians. So even as a Belgian scholar, you know, you feel like you, in my position, I'm in the periphery, let's say, of what is happening within the center of history writing. And so you immediately think about authors like Michael Kimmel and Stearns and whatever, you know, the big, you know, historiography written by Anglo-American scholars. So, but of course, you realize that, you know, I haven't even written about French scholars in my article, you know, as a Belgian, you know, so it's you all almost immediately feel like you need to write about these Anglo-American scholars. That's the general history, and then all of the rest is, let's say, a kind of extra. So, but anyway, so but of course you see that also in other historiographies, people writing on African history, Asian history, and so on. Of course, the concept of masculinity is also introduced, and so I referred to some of these books in which, of course, you see that people are very aware that introducing the concept of masculinity is it's not just something general that you can then contextualize, but that it already brings certain assumptions with it on binary distinctions, on a kind of modernization paradigms, you know, thinking about natural biological categories and then cultural ones, you know, gendered ones, and so on. So so I've referred, let's say, briefly also, of course, to this problem, you know, when you are adapting these kind of concepts that sound very general to other contexts.
Thank you. And among students and colleagues, do you see a precedent trend here in how a concept such as masculinity of recent coinage is being used historically? Is it adequately historicized, you might ask?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. So I'm teaching a class on the history of gender and sexuality, and so increasingly, of course, you are confronted with the fact that students kind of question your position, and that they you know, reflect on, or are very interested as well, of course, very curious to know you know, where you are somehow you know, positioned, whether you are what your sexual preference is even, and so on. So it's and people question easily nowadays, or seem to assume that, for instance, as a man, a cisgender man, you know, I am able to historicize in certain ways, or to talk about certain histories, and it's apparently, or they suppose it's more difficult for me to understand, for instance, what it would have been to be a woman in the 19th century and being diagnosed with hysteria, for instance. So it's yeah, it's certainly teaching that the history of gender and sexuality is you feel like your own positionality is increasingly also questions, or is you know, that it's, and it wasn't that way, I think, like 10 or 20 years ago in Belgian universities. But I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Of course, it's something, you know, it's something new. It's something that you feel like you have to deal with more than in the past, and it makes you think as well about the topics you're teaching. I find it increasingly hard, let's say, to talk, for instance, about medical doctors diagnosing patients, just talking about, for instance, scientific discourse without also having attention, let's say, to the patients, or because you feel like students want or are very interested, let's say, in also seeing the resistance or what it meant to be racialized or medicalized, or I think it has an impact on the way I teach.
Thank you, Professor Henk de Smala. Professor Antoinette Burton, you've written a Key Thinker article for us on Catherine Hall, in which you write that she's a leading feminist historian of empire, race, gender, and the nation practicing in Britain today. Could you tell our listeners who perhaps have not heard of Catherine Hall what they might learn from her work?
Sure. Sure. So Professor Hall's always been interested in helping us challenge the history of Britain as exclusively white, male, and middle class. And that, in fact, was the title of one of her edited collections back in the 90s. She's part of a post-war generation of scholars who began thinking through gender and class and then moved toward an insistence that race and empire have to figure in all of our histories of how Britain has become what it is. And over the course of her career, she's done this in a number of ways that readers or listeners can explore. First, by researching the impact of imperial ways of thinking and knowing on the so-called island story of Britain. Second, by focusing on the impact of singular and impactful figures like the missionary William Knibb and the historian Thomas Babington Macaulay. And last but not least, by leading the Legacies of British Slavery project, which, in addition to driving public conversations in Britain about the role of slavery in modern British history, has created this amazing online database of British slave ownership, which contains information about every slave owner in the British Caribbean, Mauritius, or the Cape, and hundreds of Caribbean names of slave owners, attorneys, mortgagees, and legatees that had been identified for the estates between 1763 and 1833. So taken together, her work has really transformed how we approach the history of Britain, empire, and slavery, primarily by showing its origins in the combination of material processes and the symbolic universe of racial capitalism.
Might I ask how you yourself define presentism?
I most often encounter presentism as an accusation linked to convictions that history is an objective science, that we can study it in isolation from the present, and indeed that we should rescue it from the biases and prejudices usually associated with liberalism and the left. So my own definition of presentism is the embrace of the conviction that history writing is not an objective science. It's a practice that grows out of contemporary contexts, and that historians of all stripes are immersed in the historical present in the ways that shape the methods that we use, the objects of inquiry that we choose, the archives that we identify and have access to, and the interpretive frameworks that we work through. I think we're all historical subjects. We're subject to the same contingency as the historical subjects that we study. And to be honest, the brouhaha over the question of presentism ratifies the very definition of the term. That is, battles over how the past should be written tell us more about the politics of our present condition, I think, than anything else.
I suppose that's anticipating my third question. The concepts of gender, race, and empire are highly politicized, emotive political issues. Would you say this means Catherine Hall's work is particularly relevant to a discussion of presentism?
So yes, those concepts are certainly politicized, and they always have been ever since they've been mobilized, whether singly or together, as frameworks for apprehending the past and, of course, the present. And many of you know, in the US, we're in the middle of a critical race theory crisis. Most often, scholars like Hall have used those categories intentionally to draw attention to how and why histories, like those of slavery, of women, or colonial subjects, are inherently acutely political. And I see political here simply as operating in a field of power. But as Hall's work also suggests time and again, it's not just gender and race that are political. Subjects like religion, the market, war, violence, the media, the environment, there's no arena beyond politics or beyond the fields of power through which human societies are constituted and function. So Hall's body of work has definitely helped to advance these arguments in the British Empire context, and they are now the most common framework for history writing in the West and globally as well, which I think is one reason we see such a backlash against them.
And how do you think Professor Hall herself would react, or what would she make of some of these present day debates?
Well, it's very hard to speak for Catherine, so I will not, but I do think she has always managed to combine a rigorous commitment to empiricism, that is, to the materiality of evidentiary claims about any historical subject she takes up, with a methodological approach that challenges any easy partition between the present and the past. The how did we get here question, which animates her work, has always been informed by the where do we see it from question. Questions that have animated her generation of historians and has profoundly shaped mine as well. The debates on presentism, which, as I also suggested, I think are often a trussed-up version of a call for return to history as an objective science, represent the original forms of politicized history that long masqueraded as neutral and disinterested and excluded working class people, women, and colonial subjects for centuries. So Catherine's work, oh, okay, you want me to stop? Okay, fine.
No, absolutely, you may.
One last sentence. Catherine's work, I think, offers a variety of models for denaturalizing those claims. And as the essay in Key Thinkers shows, her career-long scholarship itself models how entangled the historian's life and work is with the very historical conditions from which it emerges, and indeed, how could it be otherwise?
Thank you so much, Professor Antoinette Burton. That was fascinating. Dr. Devin Vartiya, you have contributed one of our extended essays on the historiography of race in Enlightenment thought, in which you note that historiographers paid little attention to the concept of race and racism until roughly the Second World War. Could you tell us how and why that changed?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. I think the first work to mention here would be Dialectic of Enlightenment by Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, published in 1944 by, of course, two German Jewish intellectuals who fled Nazism and settled in the United States in Los Angeles. And although in that text they didn't discuss race extensively, they did have one chapter on anti-Semitism, and they really laid what can be considered sort of the first charge from the left of the Enlightenment as not an emancipatory project, but rather perhaps a project that has led to increased social control and even oppression. But more importantly, in the post-war period, I think we should look to the context of the 1960s and 70s with decolonization and nascent Holocaust studies to see when race and racism are really taken up in the field of Enlightenment studies. So concerning the history of anti-Semitism and Holocaust studies, Leon Polyakov and George Moss's work is really important here. So looking at the longue durée origins of the Holocaust, in which the Enlightenment is very central. So as a period in which, roughly speaking, we see a switch from pre-modern anti-Judaism to sort of modern pseudo-scientific anti-Semitism. And then in the context of decolonization, the work of a French scholar, Michel Duché, I'd like to mention. In 1971, it was published, Anthropologie et Histoire au siècle des Lumières. And this is an untranslated classic, but really a wonderful work that looks at 5 Enlightenment philosophes, and in which she places them in the context of what she calls a neo-colonial interpretation of the Enlightenment.
Could you tell us something more about the Enlightenment conception of race? How does it differ from that which we might have today?
Yeah, of course. So I think there are 2 major differences that we should be aware of. And the first is the connection for 18th century Europeans of the race concept to nobility, which is quite lost today. And the second one is its, well, the lack of clarity of the concept in the 18th century. So to start with the first, so race entered European vernaculars in the 15th century and was first used to refer to the lineages of prized animals like birds of prey, and then quite quickly by noble families who had ancient or deep ancestry in the relatively deep past. And so this concept, this linking of race to nobility and ancestry survives deep into the 18th century. So for example, the Dictionary of the Académie Française, the 4th edition in 1762, gives the example of, for a definition of race, is he is from an old race, an illustrious race. So this is the first example that they give. And secondly, so what's interesting is that 18th century dictionaries and encyclopedias don't actually register its modern pseudoscientific usage. But of course, many thinkers are using it to refer to large groups of human beings that share common ancestry and or physical features, and the emphasis is placed variously. But what is striking is that thinkers important in this second strand, like the French naturalist Buffon, in his classic work Histoire naturelle, he actually uses the concept interchangeably, or the term interchangeably with distinct concepts like species, nation, and people. So there's quite a lack of precision here, compared to what we see in 19th and early 20th century scientific racial classification, scientific racism.
Switching over to our present day conception of race, to what extent do you think historians might be guilty? I mean, guilty is a negatively loaded term. To what extent are they projecting the modern day conception of race onto the study of the past? Is that a good or bad thing?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, I completely second Antoinette's concern that this is, of course, an accusation that we should be very careful to throw around. So I definitely wouldn't accuse any fellow scholars very quickly of doing this. I mean, I think that as an intellectual historian, what I'm interested in is the work that the concept of race did in 18th century thought. And so I'm always, when I teach my students, I'm always very careful to remind them that it meant something different in the 18th century, and we have to be very careful to study these things contextually. So for example, my students are often surprised to learn that justifications of empire in the pre-modern period, in the early modern period, were generally not racial in nature. So this is something they always find or often find quite surprising. That said, I think that there was a recent article published by the historian Vanita Seth in the journal History and Theory called "The Origins of Racism: A Critique of the History of Ideas," in which she shows that some of the scholars, in especially the debates on the ancient or medieval origins of race and racism, are actually sometimes fit into Quentin Skinner's category of the mythology of prolepsis. So looking at past figures, so looking at the significance of an event, projecting its later significance onto historical actors that they would not have recognized at all. And I think that this is quite a powerful critique of some of the scholarship in this debate on when and where race and racism started, that we really have to be careful about doing this contextually. That said, of course, I completely latch on to what everyone says, that we cannot escape our present moment. And so it's completely justified to be interested in racial relations and racism in the past. And that's a very valid question to investigate, of course, historically.
I'm sure we'll come back to it in the roundtable. That concludes the interviews with the 5 panelists. I thank each of them. I'm now going to hand back to Christina.
Thank you, Tyson. I'm just going to do a quick demo of the Bloomsbury History, Theory and Method platform, which published all the articles you are hearing about today. And just a reminder before I begin that you can submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll get to those questions after my demo. So here's the homepage of the resource, and you can see that the articles discussed today are collected behind this top panel. And if you scroll down, you can enter the content by type, and you have the 5 different series of exclusively commissioned articles for the resource. 1 article from each of these sections was discussed today. We also have Historiography Critical Readings, which is a 4-volume reference work examining the nature and significance of history writing from ancient worlds to the present day. And as well as exploring content by type, you can explore by people, by types of history and by topic. And this makes it useful for students looking for content to fit their particular course format. And down at the bottom, you can see our research and learning tools section. This contains our lesson plans and bibliographic guides for teachers looking for resources. We also have 71 ebooks published by Bloomsbury. And there's a couple more ways that you can access all of the content on the site via a world map and a timeline. And this means that you can search for content geographically as well as by historical period. And I'll just click through to the world map to show you how that works. So here's a map of the world with the darker areas indicating regions for which we have more content. And let's just click on Europe and say you want to look specifically at Germany. Clicking on that leads to a search of all the content we have across the site from Germany. And you can see there are 105 results across 11 pages. And down the left-hand side, you can see the taxonomy, and you can narrow your search results by content type, including ebooks and article section, by people, by period, by types of history, by topic, and by place. So let's say we want to look at our key thinker articles from Germany. You can see all the kind of key thinkers that are covered here, Hegel, Arendt, Nietzsche, and more. And just going back to the top, you can get back to the homepage by clicking the logo. And if we do that, we can have a look at the topic in focus, which is a collection of content curated from around the resource and offered up for free every few months. And currently we have our topic in focus, Presentism in Teaching History. And all the articles are collected here that are discussed today. And you can see them in their sections as well. And clicking on a section header allows you to see all the articles published under that section. So in essays on theory, method, and historiography, these are the extended essays. You can see we have 63 different articles. And just going back to the homepage, I'll show you that you can also browse content through the top, as well as via the homepage, and you can explore more on our About page too. And you'll all have a chance to explore the resource for yourselves, as we'll be circulating free login details after the event. So look out for that email later this week. And now I'm going to hand back to Rodri.
Thanks very much, Christina. So yeah, just want to open up the Q&A roundtable at this point. Coming back to the definition of presentism, we've got our various definitions back up on the screen there for people to digest and mull over. Our first question then is simply, how should we define presentism? Some of you obviously define presentism as the notion that studying the past has no value if you can't draw conclusions from the present. And others defined it as projecting modern day values onto the past. Terrell Carver's definition suggests that there's no present at all. Then we have the idea that presentism is simply reading the past through the lens of the present. And the stronger version of that claim, namely that we can't escape who we are in the present as we try to understand the past. So which definition is right? Tyson, I wonder if you can lead us off maybe with some thoughts on that.
Yeah, when I hear the word presentism, I think of Benedetto Croce, the early 20th century Italian philosopher of history, who said that all history is contemporary history, by which he meant not that all historians write about the recent past, but that there is simply no other way of writing history than through the lens of the present. That opens up all sorts of problems and discussions, but for me, I like to think of presentism in that respect as something unavoidable and something that enables new historical insight rather than being something that necessarily needs to be overcome. Of course, that doesn't mean that we write the past as we like to think about it in the present. There's obviously some discipline involved here in treating the past as something separate from the present as well. But I think Croce's phrase helps us conceptualize that in the first place. And I suppose, I mean, if I were to pass on the baton now, Dr. Varty, I was interested in what you said towards the end there with regard to Quentin Skinner and contextualism. There seems to me there to be, especially in intellectual history and the history of ideas, there's a real tension between contextualists who try to treat ideas in context and those of a more conceptual history, Kozelekian bent, who kind of see concepts as accruing new meanings over time. So that distinction between past and present might not be as distinct. Just
right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right to point to some disagreements, I think, among intellectual historians. I mean, I quoted Skinner because for my book, I drew from his methodology, especially the collection of his essays, Visions of Politics. But of course, him and fellow Cambridge School practitioners have been accused of antiquarianism, which I think is a false accusation, because what they're interested in is, of course, what Skinner says so concisely is seeing things their way, so the historical actor's way. So it's a constant conversation, I think, between present and past, and the power of that approach, I think, is to open up new possibilities, to see that our what things that we take for granted are not necessary. We're not always taken for granted, and so this is one of the most powerful things, I think, of a truly contextualist history of ideas. But other kinds of history, of course, do this as well. I mean, it's not limited to intellectual history to open up this way, this kind of alienation from the present. Yeah, that's what's key, I think, is that it's not just a justificatory practice for how we see things.
Rodri, shall we move on to the next question? There are some fantastic questions up here.
Would you like me to go? We've got a pre-submitted question from a Professor Emeritus John Olson at Queen's University, who sort of pre-booked this question. So I wonder if we can ask that one first, and then maybe move on to the questions that have popped up. So the question that John's provided here is the trope presentism a good way of headlining a number of issues related to the role of the present in history that are ongoing in historiography? Or is it a slogan arising from larger metaphysical debates therein? As John says, my question would be to the contributors, what do they make of the way the supposed problem is formulated? Is there not a need for some philosophical analysis of this trope? And where does the craze for big history fit into this story?
I don't mind saying something about big history here. Unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the author of an article that I recently read. I taught a course on big history for the first time this academic year with a geologist, two historians, other historians, and a social geographer, and it was a great learning experience. And one of the way that we started off the course was to actually begin by critiquing big history, because it's so it risks taking out human agency from history, because human beings are just sort of at the mercy of larger forces. And so this is just something that popped up. I think I may have missed the core of the question. Sorry for that, but this is something that popped into my head of just it was very helpful to remind my students of the risks of doing history in this way. There are, of course, benefits, but there are also big risks, and this requires, of course, very careful philosophical reflection of these issues of human agency. Yeah.
I thought I heard in the question a reference to epistemology, and I guess at this juncture in the conversation, I might just ask people to recall the way that the modern discipline of Western history is related to the modern practices of empire, colonial knowledge extraction and production, the notion of objectivity, of who counts as a historian and who counts as a historical subject. So all of those questions, I think, are part of our inheritance here. And there's some questions in the chat, or the Q&A, which I think may touch on these, but I just wanted to resurface that the historicity of the discipline and its relationship to imperialism as a way of knowing and thinking and being, I think is really important here.
Can I add to the agency issue that was raised before? I think it's very important, particularly when we think about teaching history to students, that we think about the different levels of agency of the people we talk about, because I think sometimes there's the perhaps the suggestion that if we provide the historical context of a particular worldview or of a particular society, that the assumption might be that that's the only way how people could have acted, because I work in Germany, because anti-Semitism was the view of quite a lot of people at a particular point in time, doesn't mean that we are suggesting that there aren't any opposing views or that you couldn't have disagreed with that type of view. So I think the idea of what level of agency we allocate to the people we talk about is quite important, and it also doesn't mean that there is lack of responsibility in one way or another, and I think that that's important to keep in mind.
I think that raises lots of interesting issues about who is allowed to be an agent to write what becomes known as history. And it's good to reflect on all the histories that don't get written or are only recently rediscovered or redefined as history. So feminists, historians, and historians from of all different kinds from all over the world have been, admitted to the circles of Anglophone knowledge production. And students often find this very exciting. I'm an external examiner somewhere, and I mean, by far the best essay that I read out of a selection was on the Haitian Revolution, which has certainly been written about before. Some historians knew about it, but there is a literature actually coming out of Haiti from people who are native there about that. And this can be picked up by students. So there's an awful lot wrapped up in this concept of agency, and also the concept of the genre of history or historiography, and what counts and who polices that, not least research councils. So I think this resource that Bloomsbury has done is, a gateway out of some of that. At least I hope it is, certainly because it's global.
Thanks, Professor Carver. I'm conscious of the fact that we've got some really good but really big questions coming through on the chat here. I think sort of 6 or 7 or 8 now it is in total, and we're running a bit short on time. Tyson, I don't know if you've had the chance to have a quick look through that list. I mean, you might be better placed than I to maybe sort of cherry pick one that you'd like to kind of dive into now. And who knows, perhaps maybe afterwards we could, sort of maybe get some correspondence on email as well, if anyone wants to kind of offer some thoughts offline to the people that have been kind enough to submit some questions that we might not get time for today, unfortunately.
I think we could say a little bit more about and I think Henk de Smala might be good here, to say a little bit more about concepts to which the historical subjects did not have access. So it's a good example for masculinity, if it is a concept that's only really gained purchase recently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question, and it's actually also a hard question, and it's you know, as a historian of masculinity, of course, what you usually do is you look, let's say, at texts or you know, read your sources, looking for traces of people kind of suggesting at a certain moment in time what masculinity consists of, and quite often it's in by seeing how certain people are called unmanly, or how people are criticized, or for instance, of course, in a colonial context, how subaltern people are you know, supposedly effeminate or lack masculinity. And so from that, from these traces or from these sources, you kind of construct what masculinity as an ideology or as a system consisted of in that period. But of course, you're doing that as a historian. You're kind of making a construction, or you're making a construction visible that in a way was hegemonic or supposedly hegemonic, and therefore remained, let's say, invisible, or not, was not, you know, analyzed in those terms, was not seen in those terms at the moment. While, of course, it's still, the same goes, of course, with also sexual categories. Is there, of course, it's a long debate on whether there's a history of homosexuality before, you know, the invention of the term homosexuality in the 1860s, and so on and so forth. So that's, but it remains a very hard, let's say, to see how subjects in the past, whether they had any notion, let's say, of, or whether they thought of themselves in those gendered ways, or whether they also indeed had a kind of assumption or a kind of understanding of the notion of masculinity, for instance. So it's I think one of the talking about presentism, it is you know, that's what we always do, I think, as historians, kind of starting from thinking or analyzing today what we think is important and what creates hierarchies, for instance, and power relationships, and then see how that worked in a different context and in a different time, where these concepts did not as such exist, and seeing how maybe that world functioned differently, and so how we cannot assume that we immediately understand these worlds, and that we are, as the word has been used as well, are alienated a bit from it. That's giving also hope, of course, because then we can start seeing how things, you know, can be different or were different, and so on, and so yeah, it's of course, you know, I'm a bit circling around the question, but I think it's something that is a fixed component of what history writing is all about, actually.
Thank you, Professor Burton. I'm interested in your response to this question. We've had something about the potential dangers of presentism, and if we grant too positive a role to presentism, do we risk losing something of the wonder of entering into an alien past, of learning something new from the past, independent of our own frames of reference in the present?
Thanks. I just think there's so much debate about any of the given topics or methodologies around questions of race and gender and sexuality that it's not really a danger of blocking plural, let's say, visions out. But I also think that incredibly roiling debate about this does obscure the question of what is the proportional role of presentism in the shaping of narratives about the past. It has a role. Is it the dominant role? Is it the only role? What are the other factors? So I think the debate itself, which is highly politicized, and I think if we think about someone in the chat said it's fairly commonsensical. It's what you find in the undergraduate classroom. We're all immersed in the present. How can we escape it? But the truth is that the discipline of history in the West was built on the conviction that not everyone should have access. I think, Tyson, you may have referenced this, or someone did. It was constructed in a kind of gatekeeping way as an objective science designed to shape, who counted. Certainly, Terrell, you said this too, who counted as a historical subject. So I think that, keeping in mind the power relations in these questions, as well as the proportional role of presentism in any of our methodological approaches, is really important.
We have a few more questions. We've had some fantastic responses that I think touch on a number of different elements of the various questions there. Do we have time for one more, or shall we conclude things there? Yeah. Yeah, I think we've reached time, and I think we'll bring things to a close. Thank you everyone for being here today. It was fascinating to hear from all 5 participants. Their articles are available. Roger, you might want to say something more about that in terms of the articles that are available.
Yes, thanks, Tyson. Yes, so as Tyson mentions, all of the articles are currently available on the resource. It's been a fascinating discussion. I just want to thank Tyson and all of the panelists for all of their really intriguing contributions. It really sort of a lot of food for thought, I think, over the course of the entire hour, and it's clear that you've engaged everyone that's taken the time to kindly join us today for the webinar, given the number of questions we've had, and it's obviously as I say, served up a lot of things for people to consider. As Christina mentioned earlier, there's going to be free login access that is going to be made available to everybody who's signed up for the webinar today, so people can take a much deeper dive of the resource and get a feel for what it's all about, and just exactly how much content that we've got there that's sort of all joined up and connected, that you can click from one article to another for. And I just want to thank everyone, and to say goodbye from everyone here at Bloomsbury, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.